Hello. Today I discuss the recent disinflation in Ghana and contextualize it within the broader disinflation experience by many other countries across the globe. So earlier this month, the Ghana Statistical Service revealed that the year-on-year inflation for January 2026 stood at 3.8%. That is a decline from the 5.4% recorded in December 2025. And when we compare to same time last year, the inflation stood at 23.6%. So it is a whopping 20 percentage point reduction on the inflation between January 2025 and now. When you think about it, the government of the day must be doing something right to get inflation calmed down by such margin in a space of just 1 year. But let's properly contextualize this. Let's put it into proper perspective. When I take the CPI data for a host of countries from the IMF data set and estimate the inflation rate for a period, say between 2017 until now, you see a certain trend. You'd see that since the cost of living crisis in 2022-2023, there's been an observed disinflation trend across the board, right? When you look at Western countries, for example, you would observe that the likes of Australia, United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and Germany had inflation shoot up from below 2% to between somewhere 7 and 12% in 2022. In fact, the United Kingdom and Germany were the most affected, with Germany's inflation rising from below 0% to about 12% in 2022. When you go to the eastern side of the globe, you would observe that many countries like Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Japan had inflation go up in similar margins, right? I think the only outlier here is India, that already had a significantly higher inflation rate prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. When you come to Africa, the inflation experience was not quite uniform. Countries like Cameroon, Togo, South Africa, and Kenya had some, increase in the inflation rate, right? But it was nothing comparable to what was observed in Ghana and Nigeria. Ghana, for example, had inflation shoot up from around 10%, significantly below the inflation rate of Nigeria, to about 55% in 2022. At the peak of the cost of living crisis, this was almost twice the inflation rate experienced by Nigeria at the same time. Nigeria's inflation was around 27-28%, right? And so when you think about it, right, you reach a certain conclusion, which is basically that it couldn't have been the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine war that affected Ghana that much. It couldn't have been the case that the COVID-19 pandemic and Russia-Ukraine war specifically selected Ghana to deal with us that much compared to how other countries experienced the cost of living crisis. So basically, Ken Ofori-Atta and the government at the time did something fundamentally wrong. So with this background, you appreciate even more how impressive the 3.8% inflation rate today is. And as expected, there's been heated political debate on the recent inflation level. For example, we have the spokesperson for the president take full credit for the government, and in doing so took a jibe at the former vice president. In response, you have the aide to the former vice president, Dennis Merkel Sabuaji, then questioned the integrity of this inflation results by pointing to the prevailing cost of living conditions, and in particular pointing out that university fees and hostel accommodation fees have gone up significantly. Without taking a side, let's properly understand what inflation is. In general, it is the sustained increase in the general price level in a country. And the inflation rate is measured by using the Consumer Price Index, the CPI index. The CPI index is an index like any other index, some would say composite index, which means that the prices of a number of goods and services are aggregated using a weighting scheme. So for example, in Ghana, it is estimated that 43% of the household expenditure goes into food, right? And so the food components of the CPI basket takes a weighting of 43% collectively. Okay? You take this weighted average every single time and then compare that level against the level, say, a year ago to calculate the year-on-year inflation rate. But apart from the categorization into food, energy, health, education, and the various components, it is further classified into imported products and domestic products. If you take a look at the GSS Consumer Price Index, you would see that the domestic side of the index is given a weighting of around 72% if you do the maths, right? While the imported commodities have a weighting of around 28%. So the two components are combined to form the overall headline year-on-year inflation. Sometimes central banks like to calculate what we call the core inflation by excluding certain volatile items such as food and energy to gain a broader sense of the underlying trend. But I will ignore that for a moment and just stick to the drivers. Some have argued that a disinflation in global commodity prices is what has led to the current drop in inflation we are experiencing in Ghana. If you look at the data, that is partly true. So when inflation shot up, it was the inflation for imported commodities that went up from around 11%. Then it was significantly below the inflation level for domestic commodities. It went up to around 64%, while domestic products inflation went from around 13% to somewhere 51%, right? In the disinflation we have seen, it is also true that the inflation for imported commodities has gone down sharply from the 64% and now around 2%, compared to domestic inflation, which went down from around 51% and currently around 4.4%. When you combine that with, for example, the trend in crude oil prices, it seemed to make sense, right? Crude oil prices went from around $70 per barrel in 2021 to $120 per barrel in 2022. That has also come down sharply and is currently trading around $64-65 per barrel. When you combine this with the fact that we had a windfall, a substantial windfall in foreign exchange due to a lot of gold export, largely driven by the sharp rise in gold prices last year, it begins to make sense where the disinflation is coming from. But hey, that takes nothing away from the current government. A reckless government could have still spent way more than necessary, and we would have inflation being relatively higher than it currently is. So the 3.8 inflation level is unquestionably a positive development, and the government deserves credit. But does this mean everything is good with the Ghanaian economy? Absolutely not. As many have pointed out, an inflation level of 3.8% and commercial lending standing around 20% because central bank policy rate is around 15.5% seem problematic, right? It just means that it is probably more lucrative to be in the business of lending money than to engage in real economic activity. And that is where I think the government can do a lot more to bring down the cost of credit so that financial services will be more in tune towards supporting economic growth in the near to long term. For want of time, I stop here and hopefully pick up in the next episode. But do let me know if you need me to address any topic in the comment section. See you around, and until then, take care and bye.